Democracy, the political system in which the people exercise the authority of governing themselves. A government for the people, by the people, and of the people, as Abraham Lincoln would eventually describe it, is an idea that goes back to the very beginnings of mankind. Anthropologists have identified that the idea dates back all the way to the Neolithic era and the very beginnings of the agricultural revolution. You see, back then, bands of hunter-gatherers, clans of 15 and up to 50 people, often connected by family ties, would travel together, hunt together, and reach decisions coming to a consensus within the clan. Other historians also theorize that early experiments with democracy must have taken place in ancient Mesopotamia and even in India, with city-states such as those of Sangas and Ghana, which were mentioned by Diodorus in his Bibliotheca Historica, being examples of them. Even during the life of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha himself, around the year 462 BC, kingdoms were governed by councils that could be described as loosely having had some democratic tendencies. But the modern definition of democracy, the one that derives its power from the words demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power, has its origin in ancient Greece. I'm Generalized, and this is Historicity, a channel in which we keep a record of the constant called time, the good and the bad, in hopes of learning to not repeat the mistakes of the past. Many people associate the birth of democracy with Cleisthenes in 508 BC, and beyond him, usually the uninitiated associated with Pericles and the rise of the Athenian Empire. And although invaluable to the development of democracy, Cleisthenes and Pericles were not the cornerstones of what we know as democracy today. The cornerstone of democracy was a Greek man by the name of Solon. You see, during his administration, Solon implemented an incredible system to deal with one of Athens' most perilous monetary crises. It was a crisis that led to the enslavement of most of its population by the ruling class, Athens' very own aristocracy, in essence creating of Athens an oligarchy that was running amok. People, hardworking people, farmers, the salt of the earth, were increasingly falling on hard times, and they were resorting to selling their family members, and in many cases themselves, into slavery in order for them to satisfy their debts. You see, in Solon's Athens, the rich were increasingly richer and the poor increasingly poorer. But the poor were also getting desperate, and this was a powder keg that Solon recognized would soon ignite revolution. A revolution that, based on numbers, since the majority of the population of Athens was at that point in debt and or enslaved, the ruling class of Athens, Athens' aristocracy, would not survive. You see, when dealing with the birth of democracy, the first thing a person must do is eliminate the tendency to deify the birth and the creation of such governing principles. Democracy was not handed down to man by the gods of Mount Olympus. It wasn't a creation of Zeus to bring peace and stability to mankind. And it wasn't a eureka moment either. Democracy as we know it today is a concept that has been worked on for thousands of years. Let's explain it in a way that might be simpler to understand. These were the economic policies that Solon had to deal with and led to the birth of the first democratic ideas in ancient Greece. The inequality that Solon had to deal with in Athens started with the introduction of money, the drachma or silver coin, into Greek life, which created a crisis among the population much like those we face today. Before money, the economic system that persisted in Greek society and much of the world really was a system based on the principle of bartering. If you and your family produce potatoes and my family and I raise cattle, we have two options. Either you and your family eat potatoes all year long and my family and I eat only meat all year long, or we can exchange our goods and both end up eating meat and potatoes. That's the system that persisted in Athens up until the 6th century BC. But the introduction of the drachma upended everything. Now goods were exchanged for silver coins, and a variety of things and monetary vehicles like never before were suddenly available to the masses. The one thing that was not available to the masses was financial literacy. If a small farmer all of a sudden had a bad year and his crops failed, instead of spending a year of hunger with his family as he would have done before, now he could just borrow money from the rich. But as well, as we all know, since money lending was introduced, other principles were also introduced to the world, those of interest and collateral. So if a rich individual in ancient Greece had a poor farmer come knocking on his door asking for a loan, what would he do in order for him to guarantee that he was going to get his money back? Remember, nothing in this world is free. He would demand interest, and he would also demand the farmer place some of his possessions as collateral in order for him to guarantee he'll see his money again. As in many other places around the world, poor farmers in ancient Greece had only one valuable possession: their land. Now, let's say that after taking that loan, that farmer again had another disastrous year, and his crops failed again. Now, not only is he in debt, but he has also lost his land for not having the resources to pay back the loan to the rich. How does a man in that situation survive? Well, if he is resourceful enough, he could guarantee himself another loan. But what possessions would he have in order for him to place as collateral? His children. In ancient Greece, children were seen as property. Wives were seen as possessions. And eventually, once everything was gone, he would sell himself into slavery in order for him to try to satisfy his debts. Now, when Solon came into power in 590 ABC, the wealthy, wisening up to the idea, began securitizing loans with the bodies of the debtors. And although in today's society that is frowned upon, in ancient Athens that was totally acceptable. That was perfectly fine and lawful, and would eventually lead to the crises in which the poor had sold themselves, their own bodies, to the rich in servitude. This was the world Solon had to deal with. And he implemented measures and reforms that, although not popular at the time, would eventually pave the way towards democracy. The first of these principles was outlawing debt-based slavery. This in itself was not a popular reform in the eyes of the aristocracy, which saw their workforce diminish overnight. The second would even be more cutting. He canceled the farmers' debts. Again, the rich saw their fortunes dwindle massively with just one reform overnight, but it averted revolution. These were the reforms that favor the poor, but he also passed reforms that favor the rich. For example, he established a system of 4 citizenship classes determined by someone's wealth rather than someone's heredity. But only the members of the top 3 classes could hold public office. Obviously, the rich were very happy about that. They were still the ones in control. Remember, this Athens, Solon's Athens, is not yet a democracy, but an oligarchy moving towards becoming a more egalitarian society. Finally, in order for him to guarantee a more equal world and one in which everyone felt their voice was being heard, Solon established a voting system in which every citizen, no matter the wealth, had a right to vote. And in order for him to establish a system of justice that did not just favor the rich or the poor, any citizen, no matter the wealth and no matter the class, could bring up charges against wrongdoers. Again, Athens' government, which was still very limited as a democracy at this time, was far from perfect. Women were not citizens. Slaves, those who had been slaves for reasons other than debts, were not citizens, and foreigners were not citizens. Only about 1/10 of the population of Athens at the time had the right to vote. But these reforms, those implemented by Solon to avert disaster, would prove to be the cornerstone, the most important political system in modern history: democracy. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, and come on, subscribe if you haven't already. and generalize. And this is history.